Thanks for joining, everyone. As you can see on my screen, you can click mute and stop video if you have a camera on your computer. That way, it doesn't record you. Neither are necessary. And if you have any questions, feel free to just click the mute to unmute it and stop me at any time. Today, you can see at the bottom of my screen here, we'll do about 15 or 20 minutes of demonstration. This webinar is mostly focused on the matrix window in Studiocode, and then we'll have a little Q&A afterwards for as long as necessary. But obviously, feel free to stop and ask me questions at any time as well.
The new ones that came with this don't have the same adapter.
Hi.
So.
Can I ask? Hi, can I ask who joined?
Hi, this is Alexis Musante.
Oh, hey, Alexis, how are you?
Hey, I'm well. How are you?
Good, thanks for joining. If you want, you can click mute and stop the video in the bottom left corner.
Okay.
And then just unmute if you have a question. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so we're going to start here. And like I said, this is mostly focused on the matrix. Feel free to stop me at any time with any questions. So first of all, this webinar probably relies on the fact that you know a little bit about Studiocode, namely that the matrix, which I'll open up first from the timeline. So you should be familiar with the movie window and a timeline here. I'll click on the matrix icon and it opens this matrix. So first thing I just want to introduce to you is the matrix. Initially at this point, there's really no need to ever save a matrix. I could just close it, reopen it from the timeline. I could reopen. If I click on the matrix again, it'll open subsequent versions of it. But at this point, there's really no need to save it. There will be a need a little bit later on, which we'll get to. But for now, just this default matrix that you get, just know that there would be no need to save it per se. So when you open the matrix, the first thing that you see is this grid, right? It's just rows and columns like a spreadsheet. And the rows here come from the rows in the timeline, you can see. And the columns come from labels. So just to paint a little bit better picture, you should be familiar with what we call a code window. And certain buttons in the code window create instances in the timeline. Those are called codes. So this taxi and bus buttons are codes. These north, west, east, south are labels, and labels are assigned to groups. Labels don't create rows or instances. They're just like tags that you apply to instances, if that makes sense. So now going back to the matrix, you can see that the rows come from codes. And here's the north, south, east, west. There was no west used, apparently. But the labels are the columns. And then you can see just above the columns are the groups. The groups categorize the labels. So that's kind of the structure of the matrix. So really simply, first, the matrix is an instance counter. So you might initially see, wow, there's 115 taxi instances with this particular label on it, right? And there's another 115 and 13, but way over here on the right, it doesn't total up accurately. I mean, you might think that, but what's really happening is that, first of all, this is just a count of the number of instances in that row. So that tells me there's 115 total instances. 12 of them have a turn on them. 103 have a straight on them. So obviously this means that many instances have more than one label on it. Like a particular taxi could have entered from the south and went straight, right? They could have both of those labels on it. So that's kind of the way to think about the structure in the matrix. So you might have noticed here that, let me move this up a little bit. When I single click on a cell in the matrix, can you see that it's highlighting, it's finding the actual instances in the cell, in the timeline, right? So let's click on this 12 turn. It actually went and highlighted those instances in the timeline, which gives you a nice little visual representation of when those things happened in terms of the whole movie. And then if I double click on that cell, it'll go ahead and retrieve those 12 instances in a new movie here, and then play those 12. So, Alexis, we're recording this too, and we'll post it if you want it.
Oh, okay. That's super helpful. Yeah, last time sure. I went back and watched the video, so thank you.
Okay, so let's see. Just double click. So, really simply, the matrix is a filter tool, right? It shows you all the instances, and then you can drill down based on a particular label like this, and then do much more, which we'll get to in a few minutes as well. So like, let's say I wanted to watch these 12 instances here that made a turn, and I wanted to watch another cell, like this bus, all the times that the bus went straight. So I wanted to watch those instances in terms of the cells. I could select multiple cells by holding Command, and then I could click on this movie icon. Now it'll make the movie of those selected cells, right? So you can make a movie of pretty much of anything you want in terms of selection in the matrix. Let's see. You can also really easily rearrange, like if the appearance of the matrix doesn't really meet what you want, you can just click and drag a row or a column wherever you want, right? It's pretty easy. I could grab a whole group, like this date group. If I don't want it to appear first, I could just click and drag it and put it at the end. And I could also easily remove a column. Like if I didn't want this column, I could just right click here, go to remove, and it would remove the column. It obviously wouldn't remove the actual data in your timeline, but it would remove the column. And then you can also sort. So up here on the top, we could go to the sort, and usually what makes sense is to sort by groups, right? So I could sort the groups ascending, which is just alphabetical. Now you can see it rearranges them there. I could go to rows, sort by color, which is lightest to darkest, or darkest to lightest, I guess, as well as alphabetically. And just by labels, I could just do a sheer alphabetical sort regardless of group. So those are the different sorting options you have. I'm going to put it back to the sort of group sort, which makes the most sense, I think. And then you can also, if you're new to Studiocode, what may not be intuitive right off the bat is that the labels, or in this case, the columns of the matrix in the matrix, are where a lot of the analytical power lies in terms of the software, not necessarily the codes. So I won't get into that too heavily, but imagine that typically if you code a movie pretty heavily, you will probably have many more labels or columns in the matrix than rows. Not always the case, but typically. So eventually it might be helpful to swap the axes here. You can see I'm up here on the timeline. So if I click swap axes, it just puts the labels on the horizontal axis so you can, read them more easily. It doesn't make a label a code or vice versa. It just changes the presentation of them in the matrix. What's also nice about the matrix is it should update in real time, meaning you might be familiar with this. I could right click on a label. I get a drop down of other groups and or labels that have ever been applied to this instance. So let's say I'm going to go to the enters group and I want to take off the north label. Now watch when I do that in the matrix. You can see that 54 just changed to a 53 in the taxi row. So let me draw your attention back here. So watch this cell. I'll go back to the same instance. And this time I'm going to put the label back on. And you can see that the matrix will update in real time. So if you had a matrix open while you were coding with a code window or doing any of this type of post labeling, it will update in real time. Another useful feature is, like I said, a lot of the analytical power lies in the labels or columns. So eventually you might become more concerned with, like, for example, a turn here, all the times a taxi or a bus made a turn. And I might want to see that in my timeline right away without having to open the matrix to get to that type of information. So I could right click on that column and go to Make Timeline Row from Selected Cells. Hopefully that terminology makes sense. So what it'll do is take those 14 instances that made a turn. When I select that, it just created this new row down here in the timeline, which is called Maneuver, which is the group dash turn, right? I could right click there and rename that row something more to my liking. But that's kind of a way to quickly filter out labels into your timeline so that they're more easily viewable without having to open the matrix. On the bottom of the matrix, you might have recognized or seen these slider bars. The way those work are, first, notice that when I click and drag from either end, really, down on the timeline, there's like a little curtain that comes in. On the right, you can see that, or on the left, whoops, sorry. Yeah, on the left, right, I could drag from either side. Sorry, my mouse is being funny here. But the point of this is, if you watch in the matrix now, when I click and drag, the numbers are changing and only reflecting the portion that's unshaded in the timeline. So this might be useful for, viewing a matrix for only certain portions of time in the timeline. Obviously, you can put the slider bars all the way back, and then it'll reflect the entire timeline's worth of data. But that's a nice way to quickly just restrict the scale or portion of the movie or timeline that you want the numbers to reflect. Okay, so now we'll talk about kind of get into where the power of the labels really lies. So, like we've been using this example, I know when 12 taxis made a turn, and I know that 2 buses made a turn. But what if I wanted to know what direction they entered the intersection at and made a turn, right? That requires kind of 2 layers of information. So the way I think about this is in terms of codes, labels, and groups, right? I want to find all the taxi instances or codes that have a turn and an east label on them. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's the thought process going into this next minute or so. You can see I have the turn column selected. I'm going to click on this addition button up at the top, and I'm going to go to enters and east first of all. So the thought here is I'm adding this east label to that enters or to the turn column. Oh, actually, you know what? I should have done this first. Sorry. Let me remove this. Here's the turn column. I'm going to right click and duplicate it first because I want to leave this plain turn column there. But now on this turn column, I'll go to add enters east, right? So now you can see this column basically is telling you, if you look up here in the gray area, it's looking for instances that have the label turn and east, right? So let's imagine I do that again. I'm going to duplicate turn. With this column, in terms of process, I showed you could go up here to this addition button. To get to the same ends, there's a different process you could use if you like this better. You could just right click on the column itself and go to add here, get that same menu, go to enters, and this time I'll do north, right? So this column now will reflect all the turns all the turns that were made entering the intersection from the north. And then the last method or way you could combine these labels with this turn is, let's see, we have east, north, south. So when I single click on a column here, you can see up in the gray area that this label is displayed. What I'll do is click and hold on south. Well, let me point out first, if I click and let go, this label switches to south. What I want to do is click, hold down, and drag right up to there, right? And now I can look for turn and south. So those are three different ways to sort of get to the same ends. And so you can see, right, there were 12 taxis that made a turn. One of them came from the, what was this, south? One of them came from the north, and 10 of them came from the east. And, you know, knowing that information might be valuable for me in my analysis. So once you start combining labels here, you can also take advantage of these Boolean operators and or not to change the relationship between those, right? So I could say turn or east, which is a little different relationship. Oh, whoops, I chose not, sorry. Or, which is a little looser of a relationship, right? And less restrictive. So that makes sense that there's more instances. But I think and usually is the most typically used operator. And you could just keep combining, right? I could now duplicate this column and then drag another label up there. And you could just continually drill down in terms of the information you're looking for to more specific numbers. So that sort of combining with the Boolean operators is only able to be done with labels as opposed to codes. Like you don't have that capability with the rows. So that's why I was saying earlier that a lot of the analytical power of the matrix and Studiocode really lies in the labels. The more labels you can slap on the instances, the more ways you have to query and search and filter and do all those advanced types of things in terms of your data and video. Okay, so I want to point out, let me close this code window. We don't need that anymore. So we have this matrix open. We've started to sort of doctor it, right? Or not doctor, we started to customize it and drill down. But first thing I want to point out is if I click on the matrix on the timeline again, it just opens the default matrix, right? So that always happens. That's why I was saying earlier, there's no real need to save this default matrix. But now that I've taken the time to start customizing this information or the matrix, it would make sense to save this matrix as a template that I could use with other timelines. So here's the matrix. Let me go to File, Save, just File, Save, or Command S. That'll bring up this dialog window, and then I'll just call this the intersection. You know what, I'm going to call it the intersections matrix because I'm going to end up using this matrix with other intersection videos. And I'll save it to the desktop. And you can see it over here on the right on my desktop. If you're using Studiocode, your icon might look a little different, but don't worry, it'll behave exactly the same way as I'm about to demonstrate. So let me close this matrix just to, make the point that it's a separate file. It doesn't anymore belong to this movie package. Now, let me close the movie package and I could go to File, let me open Intersection 2, a different movie package, right? So it's a different intersection. You can see the movie's different, but I would have coded it with the same code window. So my codes and labels and groups are the same. And now you can just double click on this. Sorry, I need to do this. Let me open it in Studiocode. And you can see that when I first open the matrix, it kind of has the remnants. So these numbers are from the old timeline, or the intersection 1, in other words. So the first thing that might make sense to do is to go to settings here. I'm going to check this box that says replace rows from selected timeline. Basically, that just means that this matrix will only reflect this one timeline for right now in terms of information. All right, so I'll do that. And you can see also here it says no linked timeline. So if I go to this menu, actually, let me do this to make a better point. I'm going to go to File and open Recent and open Intersection 1 as well. All right, so I have Intersection 1 and 2 open at the same time. So when I click on this menu here, I just get a list of all open timelines. And in my head, I want this matrix now to reflect intersection 2. So I'll just select intersection 2. And now all the numbers just regenerate to reflect this particular timeline, right? Here's intersection 2. If I wanted to go back to intersection 1, I could just click there. And now all the numbers regenerate for intersection 1. So moral of this story, right, is that the matrix, once you start customizing it like this in terms of the labels, it makes sense to save as a template that you could use with any timeline. That way you wouldn't want to have to create these customized columns for every individual timeline. So that's sort of the point of saving it as a template. Where that might be the most useful is using a matrix to view the information for a combined timeline. So I'm going to open this combined timeline. If you're not familiar with a combined timeline, it's like an aggregate of individual timelines. So obviously I coded intersections 1 and 2, but what if I wanted to see this type of information in the matrix based on the aggregate of 1 and 2, right? I could create a combined timeline, and we have other video tutorials on how to do that. But now that that timeline's open, here, let me demonstrate this first, just so you see. If I drag the playhead, you can see there's intersection 1. Look at the video. That's intersection 1. Then eventually, when I get over here, it's intersection 2. So that's what a combined timeline is. It sort of stitches many different individual timelines end to end, right? Now, if I come back to the matrix, I can tell it to reflect the information from that particular timeline. And now I'm getting, some aggregate info based on a larger sample size of movie packages. Yeah, okay. I'll mention the last couple of things here. Is on any matrix, saved or not, you could print. Let me just print it as a PDF. Print it, right? Let's call this matrix. Save it to the desktop. There it is, hiding behind there. If I open it up, I get a nice little matrix there. What's also useful is, sometimes you may want to print this as a report to give to someone, but some of the information is sensitive, or you don't want them to see it, or they don't need to see it. So I could just, for example, right-click on a cell or a group. Let me right-click on a group like intersection here. And I'll go to info and uncheck the print. So when I do that, now if I print the matrix, I'll do the same thing. Call this matrix 1. Right, now that intersection group is omitted from the printing. And then lastly, you can always export this to a text file or Excel. I'll choose Excel here. Gives me this default name, and then I'll click Save. There it is on my desktop. And now you can see that it gives you the same table, but in Excel. Now you could leverage some other features of Excel maybe to do different things. So that's all I was planning on covering today. What questions can I answer? Anyone have any questions? No, nothing?
I actually have to head to a meeting, Justin, but this was especially helpful. We're actually teaching our students. We're doing a deeper dive into the matrix the next few weeks, so I will definitely be reviewing the video in my notes for the lesson. So
cool. You should. I mean, I know you're sort of sports code-ish, but you should have a look at our university.vosaic.com.
Absolutely. University.vosaic.com.
Yeah, we have, shorter video tutorials, like a few minutes or less, organized into courses. And there's a matrix course. So you or whoever, you wanted could sign up, go there. They have to click sign up.
Okay.
Submit their info. It takes us 24 hours to check it, and then we send a notification back. But then they can sign in and see all the courses and learn at their leisure and more incremental, because this will end up being sort of a long movie, right, in the end.
Right. Okay, that's really good to know. Yeah, just it's helpful to have these as guides, and definitely some of our students, we don't always have enough time in our sessions, so some of them are always asking oh, can you send us a knowledge-based video or something like you're speaking about, so they can take it away and do it on their own time as well. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure.